The ground shook in Tehran last night. Not the distant, muffled tremor of a symbolic warning shot fired into the dark to send a diplomatic message. Not the kind of controlled detonation that rattles windows in a government compound and leaves foreign ministers issuing carefully worded statements. This was something different, something heavier, something that woke families from their sleep 3 miles from the impact zones, that shook plaster from the ceilings of apartment buildings, sending shockwaves through residential neighborhoods with a force no official statement could minimize. The kind of strike that does not ask permission and does not wait for diplomatic cover. The kind that announces itself before any government can prepare a coherent response. Israel struck Tehran, not the periphery, not a distant radar installation tucked into the desert far from human eyes. Targets inside eastern Tehran, in the capital of a nation that has spent decades building its entire military doctrine around the belief that its homeland was beyond the reach of sustained aerial pressure. That belief shattered completely somewhere in the early hours of this morning, buried under the smoke rising over the Iranian capital as the entire world scrambled to understand what it was witnessing and what it would mean for every government and every market on earth. And Tehran was not the only city burning. Within the same operational window, Israeli warplanes descended on the southern suburbs of Beirut, striking with an intensity that forced mass evacuations under cover of darkness, sending civilians flooding through narrow streets carrying whatever they could hold, guided only by emergency warnings that had arrived with barely enough time to matter. Witnesses described the bombardment as heavier than anything in recent months. Whatever ceiling had been in place, whatever invisible line had separated escalation from open war, it was no longer visible from any direction. Then came the detail that changed everything. The United States Navy, operating in the waters of the Gulf, struck and destroyed an Iranian naval drone platform at sea. Not a proxy, not a militia outpost, an Iranian military asset engaged directly by American forces in a maritime theater that sits at the center of the world's most critical energy corridor. The battlefield had just expanded beyond every boundary that had previously contained it. The United States military was now kinetically engaged across multiple domains simultaneously, and the man in the Oval Office had already made clear through his defense secretary that what the world had seen so far was not the peak of American pressure. It was the beginning of something far larger. Before we go any deeper into what this extraordinary escalation actually means, how it unfolded across multiple theaters in a single operational period, and what the United States is now preparing to unleash in the days ahead, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a single update as this crisis reshapes the balance of power across the entire Middle East and beyond. Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth delivered a statement this week that should have stopped every analyst, every market trader, and every government in the region cold. He did not speak in the careful, hedged language of diplomatic de-escalation. He did not offer the usual framework of proportionate response and measured retaliation cycles. He said with unmistakable clarity that American strikes are about to surge dramatically. Surge dramatically. Those two words, placed side by the United States Secretary of Defense, represent one of the most significant shifts in American military posture in the Middle East in years. They tell every actor in the region and every government watching from the sidelines that Washington has made a decision. The restraint phase is over. Something new and far more dangerous has begun. To understand why that statement carries the weight it does, you have to understand the geography and the stakes of what the United States is now inserting itself into. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, is arguably the single most strategically important body of water on the planet. Roughly 20% of all globally traded oil passes through this choke point every single day. Millions of barrels, hundreds of tankers. The lifeblood of economies from Tokyo to Frankfurt to Sao Paulo flows through a channel so narrow that any serious military disruption would send shockwaves through every market on Earth within hours. Iran sits on the northern coast of that strait. It has spent decades developing the missile arsenals, the naval assets, and the asymmetric warfare capabilities specifically designed to threaten closure of that waterway the moment it feels its survival is genuinely at stake. The question every strategist is now asking is exactly that. How close is Iran to feeling that its survival is on the line? The bombardment of eastern Tehran answers that question in a direction that should alarm anyone who had been hoping the conflict would find a natural ceiling before reaching the most dangerous threshold. Iran built its entire strategic identity around the doctrine of strategic depth. The idea that its proxies in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and Yemen form a defensive perimeter that keeps enemies far from Iranian soil. That perimeter has been systematically dismantled over the course of this conflict. Hezbollah has been degraded to a fraction of its former capability. Iranian-backed networks across the region have suffered severe leadership and logistical losses. And now the strikes have reached Tehran itself. The buffer is gone. The doctrine of strategic depth has failed its ultimate test. What replaces it when a state's entire defensive architecture collapses is one of the most dangerous questions in modern geopolitical history, because the historical answer almost always involves escalation toward direct confrontation rather than managed retreat. Iran has not gone silent. Fresh missile and drone operations have continued flowing from Iranian territory even as the pressure intensifies. This is the detail that separates the current moment from every previous escalation cycle in this conflict. In past exchanges, one side would strike and the other would absorb, calculate, and respond within a framework that both parties implicitly understood as containing the confrontation below a certain threshold. That framework has broken down entirely. Iran is not absorbing and recalibrating. Both sides are now escalating concurrently, with no clear mechanism in place to interrupt the momentum before it crosses a threshold from which retreat becomes impossible. Which brings us to the question that sits beneath all the tactical details of missile trajectories and drone platforms and bombing runs over Beirut. What does Donald Trump actually want from this confrontation? Because what is unfolding right now is not simply a military operation with a defined objective and a planned exit ramp. It is a high-stakes geopolitical gamble being conducted across multiple theaters simultaneously, with the most volatile energy corridor on Earth at its center. The surge language from Hegseth is not accidental. It is a policy signal. Washington is telling the world that it has made a strategic calculation that the costs of restraint now exceed the costs of escalation. Understanding what drives that calculation is essential to understanding where this crisis ends. Some analysts argue that Trump's objective is fundamentally transactional, that the military pressure being applied is a coercive tool designed to bring Iran to a negotiating table on terms Washington can accept, that the endgame is not regime collapse but a forced diplomatic settlement that reshapes Iran's nuclear program and regional posture. Under this reading, the surge in strikes is a negotiating weapon. Maximum pressure made kinetic, designed to extract maximum concessions before the costs of continued escalation force a political exit. It is coercive diplomacy pursued through airstrikes and naval engagements rather than sanctions alone. Others see something far more ambitious and far more dangerous in Washington's posture. That the Trump administration has concluded the Islamic Republic cannot be deterred or negotiated with on acceptable terms, and that the actual objective, unstated but embedded in the logic of the escalation, is to generate enough internal pressure inside Iran that the regime either fundamentally transforms or collapses under the weight of its own failures. The problem is that this reading collides violently with the realities of what a destabilized Iran actually produces. A regime under existential pressure does not quietly fold. Pressure without a credible political off-ramp produces not capitulation but radicalization, and exactly the kind of asymmetric retaliation Iran is most capable of delivering. Missile salvos designed to overwhelm defenses through volume rather than precision. Maritime attacks on Gulf shipping that require no large military formations, only the willingness to act. Activation of every remaining regional network to impose costs on American interests that multiply faster than any military campaign can neutralize them. American military posture in the Gulf is genuinely formidable. Carrier strike groups, advanced air defense systems, the most sophisticated targeting architecture ever assembled. But formidable is not invulnerable, and the history of American military engagement in the Middle East contains a persistent and painful lesson. Conventional military superiority does not translate automatically into strategic success when the adversary is willing to absorb losses and impose costs through asymmetric means indefinitely. Iran has studied that lesson carefully. The scenario keeping the most experienced regional analysts awake is not the one where Iran launches a massive strike that American defenses cleanly intercept. It is the slower, grinding scenario where Iran sustains the exchanges, activates every asymmetric option available, and forces the United States into exactly the open-ended commitment with no clear exit that has defined every American strategic failure in the region. Energy markets are already registering the anxiety embedded in this moment. Oil prices have moved sharply with the news cycle, spiking on escalation headlines, and settling only partially when officials issue reassuring statements. The underlying volatility is not going away because the underlying risk is not going away. Every tanker captain, every energy trader, every government dependent on stable Gulf oil flows is now running calculations about what happens if the current spiral reaches the point where the Strait of Hormuz becomes contested maritime space. Those calculations are not reassuring, and the markets know it. The world is watching a confrontation that has crossed too many thresholds too quickly for normal de-escalation mechanisms to catch up. Strikes on Tehran, bombardment in Beirut, American naval forces directly engaging Iranian military assets at sea, a defense secretary promising dramatic intensification, Iranian operations continuing in parallel. Whether this is a calculated gamble producing the strategic realignment Trump's team appears to be seeking, or the opening chapter of a regional war that reshapes the Middle East in ways Washington has not fully gamed out, remains the defining question of the coming weeks. The Strait of Hormuz remains open this morning, the tankers are still moving, the markets have not broken, but every one of those facts exists in the shadow of a conflict that has already exceeded every predicted ceiling, driven by an escalation logic that neither side appears positioned to interrupt. The answer is not yet written, but the pen is moving fast and the page is running out.